In the late 1930s, East Asia stood at the center of an expanding conflict driven by imperial ambition and unresolved border disputes. While Europe moved toward war, another confrontation quietly developed along the remote frontiers of Mongolia. This conflict would become known as the Battle of Khalkhin Gol. Imperial Japan had emerged as a major military power following victories in the Russo-Japanese War and the First Sino-Japanese War. By the 1930s, Japanese leadership viewed territorial expansion as essential to national survival. Limited natural resources and growing industrial demands fueled a strategy aimed at securing land, raw materials, and strategic depth. In 1931, Japan invaded Manchuria and established the puppet state of Manchukuo. This move brought Japanese forces into direct proximity with Soviet-aligned Mongolia. The border between Manchukuo and Mongolia remained poorly defined, creating fertile ground for confrontation. The Soviet Union, meanwhile, sought to protect its eastern frontier. Mongolia served as a critical buffer state between Soviet territory and Japanese-controlled lands. Soviet military planners viewed Japanese expansion as a direct threat to regional security. Ideological hostility compounded strategic tension. Japan's military leadership was divided between two competing visions: the Strike North faction, which advocated expansion into Soviet territory, and the Strike South faction, which favored movement towards Southeast Asia and the Pacific. Khalkhin Gol would decisively influence this debate. Small-scale border incidents became increasingly frequent throughout the 1930s. Patrols clashed, shots were exchanged, and casualties mounted. These encounters were often localized and unofficial, but they revealed growing hostility. By early 1939, tensions had reached a critical point. Japanese forces in Manchukuo challenged Mongolian claims along the Khalkhin Gol River. What began as a minor dispute soon escalated into a full-scale military confrontation. Neither side initially intended a major war. However, miscalculation, rigid command structures, and aggressive forward deployments created a situation where escalation became inevitable. The battlefield was remote and harsh. Vast plains, limited infrastructure, and extreme temperatures shaped the conditions under which the conflict would unfold. Logistics would prove as decisive as tactics. As spring turned to summer, both sides moved troops toward the border. The stage was set for a confrontation that would remain largely unknown outside military circles, yet its consequences would echo across the Second World War. Khalkhin Gol was not a declared war. It was a clash born of ambition, fear, and misjudgment, and it would change the course of history. The region surrounding the Khalkhin Gol River was one of the most ambiguous and volatile border zones in East Asia. The river itself flowed through open steppe, lacking clear natural boundaries that could define a stable frontier. For decades, this ambiguity had been tolerated. By the late 1930s, it became a trigger for conflict. The border dispute centered on differing interpretations of where the frontier between Manchukuo and Mongolia lay. Japanese authorities claimed the border followed the Khalkhin Gol River itself. Mongolia, supported by the Soviet Union, argued that the border lay several kilometers east of the river. This disagreement transformed routine patrol movements into acts perceived as aggression. Japanese forces in Manchukuo operated with a high degree of autonomy. Field commanders frequently tested boundaries, both literally and politically. Skirmishes were often initiated without authorization from Tokyo, reflecting the aggressive culture of the Imperial Japanese Army. Mongolian border troops, backed by Soviet advisors, responded with increasing firmness. Soviet commanders viewed even minor incursions as probes designed to assess readiness. Each encounter raised tensions further. In May 1939, Japanese cavalry units crossed into disputed territory near the Khalkhin Gol River. Mongolian forces engaged them, triggering a series of escalating clashes. What had previously been isolated incidents now involved coordinated military action. Both sides underestimated the opponent's willingness to escalate. Japanese commanders believed Soviet forces would avoid a larger confrontation. Soviet leadership assumed Japanese actions were limited demonstrations rather than precursors to war. As engagements intensified, reinforcements arrived on both sides. Artillery was deployed. Aircraft conducted reconnaissance and limited strikes. The conflict evolved from patrol skirmishes into organized combat. Diplomatic channels remained open but ineffective. Local commanders pursued military advantage while higher authorities struggled to regain control. Communication gaps between field units and central command exacerbated miscalculations. Terrain played a critical role. The open steppe favored mobility but exposed units to encirclement. Limited road networks complicated logistics. Control of river crossings became strategically important. By early June, casualties had mounted. Neither side could disengage without appearing weak. Prestige, doctrine, and ideology now bound both militaries to conflict. The border dispute had transformed into a battle in all but name. Khalkhin Gol was no longer a peripheral issue. It was a test of resolve. What began as a disagreement over a line on a map had become an armed confrontation between two great powers. The tension along the river would soon erupt into full-scale warfare. The first large-scale battles at Khalkhin Gol unfolded between May and June 1939, marking the transition from border skirmishes to open warfare. Both sides entered this phase with flawed assumptions about the nature of the conflict and the capabilities of their opponent. Japanese forces initially committed elements of the Kwantung Army, one of Imperial Japan's most prestigious formations. The Kwantung Army had earned a reputation for aggressiveness and autonomy. Its officers believed that decisive action and offensive spirit could compensate for limited numbers and equipment. Early Japanese operations emphasized rapid movement and direct engagement. Infantry units advanced across open terrain, supported by light artillery and limited armor. These tactics reflected Japanese doctrine, which prioritized infantry assault and close combat over mechanized warfare. Soviet and Mongolian forces responded with a combination of defensive positioning and counterattacks. Soviet commanders recognized the vulnerability of Japanese units operating far from supply bases. Artillery was employed to disrupt advances and inflict casualties before infantry engagement. Air power played an increasing role. Both sides deployed aircraft for reconnaissance and ground attack. Soviet aviation, benefiting from greater numbers and coordination, gradually gained superiority in the air. Japanese pilots fought aggressively but faced mounting losses. Logistics quickly emerged as a critical factor. Japanese supply lines were extended and fragile, relying on limited infrastructure across the steppe. Ammunition, fuel, and food shortages hampered sustained operations. Soviet logistics, though imperfect, proved more resilient due to centralized planning and greater resources. By mid-June, engagements intensified. Japanese units launched repeated assaults to regain lost ground. These attacks achieved localized success but failed to secure decisive outcomes. Soviet forces absorbed pressure and counterattacked, exploiting Japanese overextension. Command and control issues plagued Japanese operations. Coordination between infantry, artillery, and air units was limited. Communications were unreliable, leading to fragmented attacks and missed opportunities. Soviet forces, meanwhile, began consolidating their positions. Reinforcements arrived, including additional artillery and armor. Mongolian cavalry units provided reconnaissance and screening, enhancing situational awareness. Casualties mounted on both sides. The scale of fighting exceeded initial expectations, and the conflict could no longer be dismissed as a minor border incident. Reports reaching Tokyo and Moscow reflected growing concern. Despite losses, Japanese commanders remained committed to offensive action. Withdrawal was considered unacceptable, both strategically and culturally. This commitment would shape subsequent decisions, locking Japanese forces into an increasingly unfavorable battle. By the end of June 1939, the first phase of the Battle of Khalkhin Gol had revealed fundamental differences in doctrine, logistics, and command philosophy. The conflict was far from over. The early battles set the stage for escalation. What followed would determine not only the outcome at Khalkhin Gol, but the strategic direction of Japan itself.